This is a 2003 Business Week front page. Is your job next? And I'm sure, and that was 8 years ago, I'm sure that many people who said no to that are probably looking for a job now. And what does the future hold? It depends. Let's move on. I will look at distance in terms of ownership distance, and then physical distance and cultural distance. Let's start with ownership distance first. What are the possibilities? It's not 0-1 either here. You've got the possibility to put it a large distance, far away, or close. Separate firm, separate facility, single process. Build, operate, and transfer. Joint venture, shared employees, or wholly-owned firm, same facility, multiple process. This obviously is high cost. This is low cost, but high invisible costs. And I want to address those invisible costs after looking at the cultural distance aspect. To get us in the mood to discuss distance, language distance, cultural distance, let's take just 2 minutes to look at a few bits of videos.
Because we are calling them and we are selling some things which they don't like or like. But it's our job, we are doing it. It's the customer end. If they like it, they're going to take it. That's it. Australia or some other country, if you pitch the product and sometimes if they don't want also they'll be listening to the call. But Americans are not like that. If they want, they listen. Otherwise they won't. They'll just disconnect. Sometimes they'll be abusing us like in bad words.
This is in Chile. They serve Spain and the Spanish-speaking world.
mensuales, quizás pagar 19,95 con nosotros, una bastante diferencia, es considerable.
Nos convence por el precio y todo esto, pero vamos que no, ahora mismo no queremos cambiar.
Usted solamente por el coste de 12,95 euros puede obtener llamadas gratis para llamar a todo Madrid.
You notice the accent here, right?
A Sevilla, a todas las partes
Chilenos
puede hacer llamadas
speaking
metropolitanas, locales e interprovinciales.
the Aragon
Por lo que me va a decir,
English,
me parece
Spanish.
que no me va a interesar, ¿eh?
Vale, venga, que tenga buenas tardes.
Morocco.
Voilà. Ensuite, tous les programmes au niveau de MSN, c'est ça?
Same day. If you don't get the French,
Je vous écoute.
you'll get the face.
Je suis pas très... Je suis... Madame, démarrez, arrêtez, on va démarrer pour l'arrêter. Non, c'est pas une insulte, c'est juste une suggestion, monsieur Lazare. Même avec les outils que j'ai là, je la trouve pas. Sur l'ordinateur, ça s'appelle un bureau, monsieur. La première fenêtre qui s'ouvre, là vous avez une corbeille, etc. Ça s'appelle un bureau si vous ne le savez pas. Et ben on apprend tous les jours. C'est ce que je suis. Monsieur, vous parlez gentiment, s'il vous plaît. Oui, mais tout simplement, je vous ai dit de retourner sur votre bureau. Vous m'avez dit je suis à la maison.
For or a translation, he told the customer to go back to go to this desktop, and apparently the client he said, I'm at home, I don't have a desktop here. So but you see, smile, you sound just like you look, and you could get a feeling for it. This is not an easy job. 300, 400 calls a day. Let's investigate a little more systematically, analytically, if you like, these dimensions. Distance is travel time. If you're in America and going to India, that's a long stretch. And then you got time zones. You got to do that often. Certainly many employees will think it over and look for alternatives. A few times is tourism. Wow. After a while, it gets to be very tough physically. If you're in America and you travel south, it could be, if you go to Chile or Argentina, it may take a while. You go through Miami, wait hours and so on. It's no fun. But you're in the same time zone. You get there, you sleep. That's got to be taken into account. Other variables. Okay, accent intelligibility, of course. If you don't understand, you can't fix the problem. Further, if someone speaks makes mistakes, part of your brain wants to fix those mistakes. So that's part of your CPU that's not available. And there's an emotion there that's not really conducive to good relationship. If you don't travel much, airports, there's a lot of important messages going on. Very often it's people who don't speak English as their native language, plus noise. I don't get the message most of the time. That's really quite frustrating. Accent is who you are. People react differently to different accents. There are studies in that respect. It is not being politically correct to say that people will not react to an accent. They do. And they do react differently to different accents. As service provider, we should know that because it interferes with relationship and with the service and the value that we are creating. Cultural side of things. Let me move on the other side here. Communication style. We assume here in the West that it is our job as communicator to make ourselves understood, to be explicit in any circumstances. In other cultures, it is whoever receives the message. The burden is on he or she to understand. And you rely on context a lot. Some culture will rely on context. The same word spoken slightly different manner will mean different things. It's pretty hardwired and hard to change. You may change accent. You may change with working at it, and I'm quite amazed at what they can do. Looking at the Chilean speaking the Spanish from Spain, Castellano, impressive. So there's a lot that can be done, but there are limits. Individual culture versus collectivist culture don't think the same way. Particularism is where you don't treat people the same way. You treat people, depending on who they are, differently. That's programmed as well. You're trying to understand who you are, and then we'll deal with you according to that perception. This is not what we expect as customers. Power distance is in some cultures, and we don't do that very much here, but we do to some extent, but the distance with the top level is very high. It's perceived, the psychological distance is perceived as very high. And therefore you tend to agree and not disagree. Again, related to previous point, conflicts is avoided. In collectivist culture, conflicts is avoided. And people are not assertive enough, especially with high power distance. Time relationship, we here are monochronic people. We divide our time into time slots, almost mathematically, and we allocate different time slots to different activities. One time slot, one activity. In other cultures, time goes on and you do many things in parallel. Some stop, some move forward, events take place, cultural planned events take place. And being at a specific time, at a specific place, is not inborn. It goes against the grain. A lot can be learned, but there's a lot of effort that has to go into it. And if the employee communicating with the customer is busy deactivating many of his innate programming, of course, it makes it difficult to find someone who can do that well and still have the energy to connect with the customer as he must to solve the problem. Let's look at some countries now. US, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, more or less the same along these dimensions. If you move already to Mexico, you've got the high collectivist orientation. You've got a high power distance as well. You're not as assertive. You avoid conflicts. You tend to treat people differently. Mexico, of course, located very conveniently. And the further you go, of course, the higher the distance and the higher the challenge in establishing the right type of relationship. And that shouldn't say that you shouldn't do it, but that you should use this type of cheap, very low cost contact where the intensity of interaction, the complexity of interaction, and your ability to manage that is appropriate. Let's look again at this cost, invisible cost, risks. Labor cost, very low on this side, very high urban US. Cultural distance, as we just illustrated, is very low here. That's perfect fit, but very high cost, so you got a trade-off here. And finally, infrastructure quality, as we saw in some of the videos, still the gap is very big, but narrowing, just as the salary gap is narrowing as well. We're starting to see some important shortages in key areas of eye level, eye knowledge manpower. And that means the price is going up and the key people are moving around. There is competition for the best people. That means trouble for you as a customer. One example, you are, some medical notes are being taken by hands, or employee expense report. There's a lot of processing to digitize that, so they are scanned and sent away to China to someone who doesn't speak English. You can type in the character, and because it's so cheap, you can have a second, even a third person copy it. That's one way of doing things. Or you can go to India with someone who speaks very good English, Barbados, native English speaker, Ireland, Canada, and so on. There's a gradation of risk, cost, trade-off, again, to be adjusted according to the challenge. So let's look at this space here, the sourcing space. Ownership on the one hand, location, domestic, offshore. I call this the sourcing space, and let's look at the 4 quadrants. We will refer to a domestic process that we keep domestic, but we outsource it to someone else as the process proficiency category. Good example is teacher-created resources. They're a small outfit that develop material for schools. They sell this material directly, but they sell it mostly at the beginning of the school year. So they suddenly need a high capability and a high capacity for response that they cannot have internally because they'd be stuck with idle resources a lot of the time. They also need someone who can relate to a school locally, who has a local feel to it as well. They outsourced to Teledirect. It takes Teledirect about a day, half a day to a day, to learn or relearn the stuff. and then they're up to scale very quickly to the level of response and service rate that teacher-created resources requests. Process proficiency. If you look at offshore outsource, that's the furthest you can be in terms of distance. That's low cost. Conseco, in the insurance industry, first created a call center in India. It was offshore initially, but captive. But when they scaled down, they had excess capacity that they started to sell to financial companies. Low cost for these people. Quality of relationship is not first rate, was not first rate, and is improving. Some financial company trying to position themselves, strategy now, trying to position themselves as high level, have rather gone with cheap competence than low cost. American Express, for example, is a premium brand, and they try to maintain and keep under control this type of resource to make sure of the quality, because it is vital to their differentiation. Swiss Air does the same thing. They also keep, by the way, to manage the country risk. They also have centers at home in the US. Domestic and captive, closest you can get. Local feel. You'd have something like North Face, for example. They sell equipment for the north, for people who make sports in the cold. They need people who can relate to that sort of environment, and they are a premium brand as well. So they like to keep this under control and make sure that the relationship gets created very easily without interference as much as possible. Day Spa is another similar type of outfit that sells equipment to spas for different type of therapies, massage therapies and others. They again need to create a contact where whoever's buying feels that he's talking to an expert. They need people who can relate to this type of fitness world, people worrying, and whoever buys the equipment needs to know that the salesperson understands their customers and can relate to the health conscious type of people. Those are 4, not 0, 1, of course, there's 4, but there are continuum. This is the sourcing space that has to be matched with the process space. Mapping one onto the other and knowing your capability for process management, your evolving, dynamically evolving capability for process management, is the right way to manage outsourcing. What are the benefits of outsourcing? Just as a refresher then, cost, the most important benefit. Flexibility in terms of scalability, the ability to scale up demand, decrease demand, and keep resources invested somewhere else, and your best people doing something that they do best as well. Innovation, in theory, if not always in practice. If you have an expert doing that, you should be able to innovate where you couldn't in practice. Response time, setup time should be faster if you have the right person doing the job. And again, for the same reason, quality should be the same. This is the data from American Society for Quality BPO survey 2010. They asked their customers, what benefits are you expecting when you made the decision? Oh, and this is ranking. So reduce cost by a long shot was the major objective sought. And then efficiency, get the results done. And flexibility. This ranking varies from one industry to the other. For example, consulting, large consulting firm. We're really looking for their workforce, really looking to focus on their core competencies. Because of the price they pay the people, they want the best people to do consulting and not to be involved in things that can be done somewhere else. Aerospace industry as well was giving a very high priority to focusing on core competencies. Many of the others were looking for low cost. As we have already shown, these benefits come with risks. Let's separate the risk and zoom in a bit more on what type of risk there are. Market performance risk, and much less understood, and maybe potentially more important, organizational risk. There are risks in the project when you actually outsource. Then there's the short-term risk and the long-term risk. Let's look at them in turn. In the project per se, this is a risky period. On the client side, it turns out that many outsourcers had underestimated the costs, and they were pursuing a mirage. Their process management maturity was not what it should have been or what they thought it was. They didn't understand the process they were outsourcing very well, and they couldn't manage it and control it from a distance. And the strategic part, they didn't have a good strategic consensus. On the vendor side, the dog and pony show is one thing. The actual delivery was a surprise at times. Heavy turnover, as I mentioned, and that's increasing in some sectors, and weak security practices in the insurance industry. For example, a recent study of 120 German banks. They thought that the security side and the financial side was extremely important. And these banks have outsourced relatively little. And if there's one thing the vendors could do to actually improve their business, it would be to manage the security risk. And then there's the relationship. It takes two to tango. Lack of precise, and at first they didn't agree on the specs exactly. Language and culture misalignment, things that I've discussed essentially. Incompatible pace of technological change. Those two organizations not only have to connect, they have to stay at pace. Loss of continuity due to employee shuffle and so on. Those are the immediate risk. And then there's the short-term and long-term risk, both in terms of market and organizational aspects. Market performance, short-term, things that have already been mentioned. Lower quality, increasing customer complaints, operation shutdown as well. Long-term, price creep. You have a contract, but you've never done this before, and you realize at some point that the price is slowly going up and that your quality is going down at the same time. You're in trouble. Low rate of innovation is a common complaint. We thought they would we thought they would be innovators. Organization-wise, loss of IT or business knowledge, loss of loyal and capable employees, employee morale. Those are invisible intangibles. Loss of confidential information. What's that worth? And over the long term, operational dependency. Loss of strategic asset. You didn't think it was strategic per se, but it was part of something else, which is strategic. And to do the something else, you need that, and you've lost it. And your supplier, your vendor is not really up to complement what you need at that level. This is the part of the iceberg under the water. What compounds this situation is the following. On the short term, you have problems, but things tend to improve as you adjust. As you improve, of course, you find out where the gaps are. Your vendor understands you a little better. Your relationship starts improving. And as a result, your short-term performance risks decrease. That's all fine and dandy. Except that it lulls you into thinking that everything is fine. Because these unmeasurable, invisible, but fundamental risks keep on going. Especially if you're not aware of them. So there is, and I'm not trying to be unduly negative here, you should look coldly at the risk and make, as in any situation, a cold assessment of what they are and of your capability of doing with them, and what countermeasure you can put in place to make sure, first, that you outsource judiciously, and then that you manage, evaluate and manage the risks as they evolve. So again, the short-term reinforcement leads to an improvement here that may lull you into forgetting about this. My advice to you today is don't. Assessing then your capability to outsource. Vision, strategic clarity, coherence. Culture, rigor, analytical capability, relational capability. Process management maturity, I think I've discussed that plenty. Just as a reminder of the elements that determines your outsourcing capability. How's BPO today? And I will refer back to the 2010 American Society for Quality survey, 140 organizations in the US. I'm sure they're all, I'm certainly very large majority in the US and Canada. How do service provider meet your requirements? In blue, don't meet my requirement. And you will notice that in innovating and making process improvements, 55% don't. This is alarming. And again, it varies from one industry to the other. Still, and if you look at what could they do to improve, you're back to what we were discussing, improve process management. Many apparently manage by fiat, ad hoc, rather than manage processes themselves very well. They may know the business, they make it work, but they're not as good. And I will have to nuance that, many are not as good as you thought they were. And the message is, don't think. Go look, audit your service provider to make sure that his actions are where his mouth is. A clear understanding of their process, which will be much easier if you understand your own. Then first, understand, characterize your process. Understand the business, even if you don't want to stay in the business. Then you're in a position to find a truly capable provider, and one that has the opportunity and has the likelihood and the capabilities to grow with you. Recap then. Outsourcing is not a crutch for poorly managed company. For them, outsourcing is giving up from the frying pan into the fire. For organizations with a clear strategic outlook and mature process architecture and management capability, it is and can be, has been shown to be, a sustainable source of strategic advantage. The business case must consider invisible costs. They are tough to manage and define and measure. They must be defined, measured, and managed. A good understanding of your process space and the quickly evolving sourcing space. Don't build your case based on what was true last year. It's changing very fast. The sourcing strategy must be evolutive then, and process governance systems must adjust dynamically to the evolving environment. That will conclude this presentation today. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure on this side of the camera.